Welcome back, Split the Difference friends and Split the Difference family. We have another awesome episode for y'all today. I know that I have been accused of saying it before, but I legitimately believe that this is the best podcast that we have done thus far. It is our fourth Guestisode with our guest, Charles McBride, who is a very smart, driven, and talented young man. He's working on a wide variety of different things, and we covered a wide gambit of different topics, all the way from the nonprofit that he works for called FarmLink that connects a lot of farms and helps to reduce a lot of food waste across America. He's actively involved in that as well. And then we moved on to a lot of other different topics, some of them political, some not so political, but he brought a lot of really good insights. We had a lot of really great conversations, and I am very much looking forward to all of y'all listening to it, giving me your feedback, and letting me know what you think as well. I hope that all of y'all enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed this conversation. So without further ado, this is our fourth Guestisode with Charles McBride. We are live and we're ready to go. Cool. Charles, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Yeah, I'm so excited. It's I'm upset that we didn't get a touch base when I was in South Carolina, but this is the next best thing, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we were trying to get you on for like a couple of weeks, and then it was like schedules were conflicting, and now you're out in California, right? You're out in LA?
I am. Yeah. I'm from Colombia though, originally, and I didn't live there when I was living back in South Carolina, but I passed through there fairly frequently. It just never seemed to work out when I was going through. So,
gotcha. Did you go to USC as well?
I did. Yeah.
Okay,
I went to USC.
Cool.
The real
Awesome.
USC. People out here think that means California.
Right. That is the fake USC through and through. I am also Gamecock, right, and I'll rep that proudly.
Good deal. We were a school before they were a state. So if anybody ever tells you differently, just tell them that.
That's a fact. That's 100% a fact. So what brought you out to California? What are you doing in LA?
To be honest, I just kind of needed to turn the page. I had been on the East Coast for a long time. I spent most of my life in South Carolina, and then spent the last 3 years in DC. Except for 2020, I came back to South Carolina for quarantine. And I was honestly just a little bit done with the East Coast. And I figured I had a lot of flexibility for the first time in a very long time. And if I wanted to make a new start, this would be the time and the place to do it. Los Angeles, I think, it confuses people because it doesn't feel like my brand. But I have some really dear friends out here, and I'm looking forward to kind of making new connections and finding a job I really like. And
that's important.
The organization, the charity that I currently work for is a lot of people are based out here. So I kind of have an automatic network as soon as I showed up, which is really nice.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I was going to ask you about that, and that's the perfect segue into it. What is that? What all do you do for them?
Okay, yeah. So the FarmLink Project it's an organization that solves a supply chain hang-up, where basically, on the one hand, you have massive food insecurity in the United States. We have 1 in 5 children are going to bed hungry every night, and 1 in 5 people are experiencing food insecurity. And then you have 40% of our food being wasted every single year. America wastes more food than any other country. We produce a lot of food, but that comes with a lot of waste. So what FarmLink does is it finds excess produce that's going to waste at farms and at delivery sites, and rejected produce, and we transport it to food banks that need it. So we connect food waste with food insecurity and try to solve both those problems at once. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it started right when COVID happened. A couple of weeks later, my friends James and Aiden just rented a truck because they read this article in the New York Times about people, plowing under hundreds of thousands of pounds of potatoes. And so they just rented a truck and delivered a bunch of potatoes to a food bank in California. And that's kind of how it started. And now we're like several hundred volunteers strewn across, dozens of states. And we're about to hit 30 million pounds of rescued produce delivered to people who need it. So it's very exciting.
That is awesome. And that is work that, needs to be done. And it's amazing to think about the fact that, like, we are living in, honestly, one of the wealthiest nations that has ever been, created in the history of the world. And we
the wealthiest, yeah.
Right. And we have so much surplus always. There's always surplus for absolutely everything. And yet is such a significant problem with poverty. There's such a significant problem with hunger. And a lot of it's amazing that it can be as a result of literally just a supply chain. That, like, there's just a disconnect between people either on farms or in restaurants or at food banks. And, like, there's a huge problem with waste, and, like, restaurants throw out their waste every single day instead of, I've heard of a couple other charities as well that are help with, like, linking restaurants with food banks and stuff as well, or homeless shelters. But it really is amazing that, like, how can there be this much waste and yet so many people are going hungry?
Well, it's a direct result of policy,
right.
In many ways. We used to supply food to meet the demand, but the cost wouldn't be really managed. But then, kind of in the 1960s and 70s, we decided to shift our agriculture policy towards overproduction so that we could drive down prices and make it more accessible for people, with the end result being, we waste 40% of our produce, and we're paying farmers to grow crops that nobody's going to eat.
Right.
And so there's a whole host of regulation that either needs to happen or needs to be repealed and rolled back in order for us to have, like, a functioning agriculture system. Because it's completely shameful that the richest country in the world has 1 out of every 5 kids going to bed hungry, and that's in addition to not having a functioning healthcare system and not having a large social safety net. So one of the things that we realized very early on is that we can try and plug this supply chain gap, but without really addressing the underlying policy concerns and regulation concerns, then we're going to be a drop in the bucket compared to what needs to be done on this on this problem.
Right. So what do you think would be specific things policy-wise that would be able to, like, help bridge that gap better? Is it just limiting the amount of food that farmers can grow? Is it just limiting the funding that farmers could get, not subsidizing farmers in specific ways? Like, what do you think is the best way to slow that down?
Well, every problem is more complex and more nuanced than we'd like to think. And there are a million ways that we could go after farm subsidies and try and tackle that problem. And there's a lot of much more intelligent people than me and my team who've been looking into those sorts of things. And one of the things that my team does best is lift up other organizations and other people. And so if there's someone who's better at what we're doing or at something that we want to do, we're going to lift them up and bring them into the spotlight rather than trying to hog that for ourselves, because the entire project is based off of collaboration. But there are a number of things. So one thing that hops to mind is the way that the FDA regulates when, like, sell-by dates and that sort of stuff. A lot of the waste comes from food that is still good being, like, for instance, it is illegal in many instances for a restaurant to get rid of, to give its excess food to a food bank.
Right.
Because of these FDA restrictions. So the way that we're trying to solve that is by trying to find a balance, policy-wise, between, how could we save some more of this food, and how do we prevent, like, a salmonella outbreak? Or,
because neither of those are good. Especially not in a food bank, right?
Yeah, exactly. You don't want one bad batch of romaine lettuce showing up and, suddenly all of Compton is, has salmonella poisoning or whatever.
Right.
I'm not actually sure that you get salmonella from lettuce, but anyway.
Honestly, your guess is as good as mine.
There we go.
I do know there was like something with romaine lettuce like last year, where a bunch of it had like E. coli. Yeah.
Yeah.
Either way, E. coli or salmonella.
That's right. I think you get salmonella from like toads and stuff, but whatever. I'm going to say it confidently, and people will just ignore it. So
Yep.
yeah, I mean, we have a policy team that we're setting up, and hopefully, we would love to be able to, help create policy around food waste, whether through this organization or through other organizations. As a 501c3, it's difficult for us to lobby
Yeah.
and advocate for specific policy proposals or specific political agendas. But there are some things that we can do, and we can also set up other organizations or work with other organizations that are already doing that.
Right.
And that's the coolest thing is the entire project is basically just a connector.
Yeah.
We find relationships and we cultivate those, and people who are already doing good things, we bring that to the forefront.
Right. Try to plug everybody in. Yeah. And it's interesting. So I work, I work currently in my day job is I wish it was podcasting all the time, but unfortunately that's not what I do all day. But I work for a farm. I work in farm credit. So I work in agriculture. And
Wow.
I'm on the finance side of it. So everything that I'm looking at is all very marketing and market centric. And the farm credit system that has been created in order to be able to kind of like fund the underside of agriculture is actually extremely interesting, and it's got a long history that goes back to the early 1900s. But the most interesting thing is when you look at the farming system and the structure of the entirety of the agriculture system in the United States is the vast majority of the farms that we have are actually smaller farms, much smaller farms with older people on them. I mean, the standard farmer is a 55-year-old white right-handed male, right? That is just
Right.
what almost every single farmer looks like. And for the most part, most of those farmers are struggling to make ends meet in terms of struggling to turn a
Right.
profit every single year. And
Yeah.
the vast majority of the food that is going into a Walmart or going into a Lowe's grocer or wherever else that it might be, oftentimes ends up coming from a really, really large ag producer. And they have, the idea of letting 10,000 pounds of potatoes go to waste. Of course, that's not good, and it touches their bottom line a little bit. But if you're, farming 500,000 acres in Idaho, or 200,000 acres or something up in Idaho, and you're growing potatoes, like you're not thinking about
drop in the
10,000
bucket.
pounds, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not that big of a deal. And so shifting, I think that there's even, in terms of a policy standpoint, there's even a way I think that you could shift some of even the farm credit system a bit to be able to help promote some of the ways that farmers and in agriculture actually lended to, so that they're maybe even have incentives around, if you're able to save or donate a certain amount of the crop that you've gotten, then maybe you get a point off of an interest rate, or, obviously that's totally spitballing ideas, but
No, that's
I'm
actually
sure
something our tax team is actually working on that very thing right now, both for the small farms and for the ag producers. You always, unfortunately, a lot of times you have to incentivize goodwill.
right.
And that's one way you can do it.
Almost always how
Another
it
is,
goes.
we're developing a carbon credit system because we're ultimately trying to be, our major goal is sustainability and scalability. We want to make sure that we can continue to grow at just the massive pace that we've been growing, but also do so in a way that's not just ridiculously increasing our carbon footprint.
Right.
And so, that's something that's in the works right now, and that's very exciting.
Yeah, yeah. So like when you say reducing your carbon footprint, do you mean that specifically in like we're not going to use paper, or do you mean that in like other ways in relation to like how you guys communicate with and transfer food back and forth? Because you said you were using like a lot of trucks or something.
Yeah, so we've got it's kind of we're coordinating a massive transportation infrastructure all around the country. And trying to do that in a efficient and sustainable way is difficult, but it's something that we're just starting to master.
Right. Yeah, and that's tough to do. That is very difficult to do. But I mean, so all right, this is totally off topic completely. But what do you think about like Tesla electric vehicles? Like, do you think that that's the future of reducing carbon footprint in terms of transportation?
Well, it's funny. I know I was the first one to bring up the phrase carbon footprint, but that phrase and that concept was actually invented by British Petroleum in order to make people individualize the responsibility for and the effects of climate change. And so that they didn't go calling at the big oil and coal and natural gas companies and ask why they were responsible. If you feel guilty yourself and you feel better about yourself by, putting your cans in a certain bag and, not drinking from a plastic straw, then you can both feel better about yourself and not be thinking about who the real causes of the problem are. Because the truth is that it's about 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of pollution. That's leading to climate change. So I think that's one thing. Whenever you're having a conversation about carbon footprints and stuff, I think you have to realize it's a phrase directly invented by the fossil fuel industry in order to shift blame and responsibility for climate change onto individuals rather than corporations. And on that very note, when it comes to things like Tesla, I think it's great that we have electric vehicles. I'm thinking about buying an electric motorcycle soon. I've been looking at one. I think that is the future, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a clean future, because unless we can actually, if you're blowing the tops off mountains in West Virginia to get the coal out of them, and thousands of West Virginians and Kentuckians are dying of black lung, to get this clean energy source that's going to run your electric vehicles, well then, that's only a half step, maybe better than stripping the natural world for spare parts in the oil and gas industry. Right. And so I think you have to, the vehicles themselves do need to become cleaner. And I think California is obviously taking a lot of steps. They're banning diesel and petrol engines after 2030, I believe it is.
Yeah, I think it's 2030.
And I think a lot of companies like GM are really trying to get on board that, on the train that, Tesla and others started.
Right. Again, yeah. I've seen multiple companies, like GM's a great example of, they're coming out with an entire electric vehicle line, like full from pickup trucks all the way down to sedans that they're rolling out.
And I think that's awesome. But again, if you're filling that with dirty coal electricity, then, I think we have to solve that before we can solve the electric vehicle problem. Right. I've always been a big advocate of nuclear energy. I obviously think that, we should be shifting towards solar and wind. I just think I've always been of the opinion that nuclear energy is going to get us there a lot faster.
I agree with that completely.
Yeah. When you're talking about us being on the clock, in terms of climate change, it just puts so many things into perspective. And the problem is that nuclear energy has really the only problem facing it is a high degree of public mistrust, which is based off of, frankly,
Chernobyl, Fukushima. A couple of small, well, I don't want to say small because I don't want to belittle what happened, but very, very poorly maintained nuclear facilities that had very little regulation around them ended up exploding and, killing and devastating the environment around it, which is, you should be scared of that. There should be things that are in place, but I think that the gutting in a lot of ways of the nuclear energy here in the United States has been a very, very poor decision in terms of meeting our energy needs going forward.
Especially in a temporary sense, because we do need to be investing in wind and solar, but we have to have something that can replace our current fossil fuel reliance. And South Carolina is, as you know, probably a heavily nuclear powered region. And I think the percentage of nuclear energy that we use, I think it approaches what the percentage that France uses. So there are some regions of the country that are heavily investing in nuclear. It's kind of stalled out across the board. Yeah. And that's for a number of reasons. Part of it is it's a very expensive endeavor for a company to want to build a power plant. Right. And there was a loan guarantee program from the federal government for a while that basically said, if the company defaults, then we'll take care of it, which allowed these companies to take that additional risk to be willing to build a power plant. And then people are concerned about the waste, but that's not really an issue. We can store that stuff in Yucca Mountain, and then this one plant in New Mexico for 10,000 years to come. So I don't really think that that's a huge issue. And of course, U.S. United States regulatory standard. Man, I really should just be a lobbyist for like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
That's what it sounds like, dude. You're selling me on it right now.
NRC, if you're watching this Zoom, you can hire me. Yeah. So I mean, I think when it comes to the waste, people, in terms of just the nuclear project in general, you have to get people over images of Fukushima and images of Chernobyl. Right. Because it's just not how it works in the US. Like the only nuclear disaster that we had was the 3 Mile Island incident. Mm-hmm. Nobody was hurt or injured, and they repopulated the island after several years. It was actually a success story for the fail-safe mechanisms that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission put in place. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is the most efficient government agency and the most capable. Like, I think the standards that they are held to, they're like more than NASA and more than like the Department of Defense and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's incredible.
Really do their job well.
Well, I've got 4 or 5 buddies that all work out the Savannah River Site Complex, which is one of the larger nuclear facilities in the Southeast. On the Savannah River, and the amount of training that they have to go through, it is a 6 to 8 month training process as soon as they walk in the door. And I mean, they're not allowed to get near anything. Doesn't matter if they're just doing operations, like doesn't matter if they're just doing payroll, like everything has got to be like top to bottom. You have to know exactly where you need to be at all times. You're not allowed to have your cell phone on you hardly ever. You're walking in there at like 8 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, and you're not leaving until 8 or 7 or 8 at night. Like, it is very, very stringent. And I mean, like, that's how it has to be. You know, I mean, those are the people that are literally keeping within a 100-mile radius, everybody's safe. But the amount of clean energy that you get out of any type of nuclear energy is, I mean, leaps and bounds better than what oil or natural gas or coal or any other fossil fuels give you as well. So, I agree with you. I think a lot of it is PR. I think that nuclear energy over the past 30 to 40 years in the United States has been a PR disaster. Whereas you look at a place like Sweden or Denmark or, especially a lot of the Nordic countries where they've heavily invested in nuclear energy over the past 20 to 30 years. And they're running, the vast majority of, I'd have to fact check that, but they're running a good portion of their energy off of nuclear and wind and solar as well.
Yeah. I definitely think it's one of those things that you have to get over the PR campaign. Mm-hmm. But I think there's so much energy and so much incentive behind wind and solar now that I think people are going to keep going that route rather than energy. I think people think nuclear energy had its day, and until we kind of master fusion, which I think that there's a lot of potential there. I think that within our lifetimes we'll have nuclear fusion.
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, even fission is incredible.
It is. You can literally you can hook up a U.S. Navy submarine to the New York City power grid and run it for months.
Right.
The entire city.
It's unbelievable. Yeah. I was wondering if wind and solar was going to get basically get a real bad rap after what went down in Texas over this past month, because I think that there were a lot of people that were blaming wind and solar for what went down and what happened. And I was wondering if there's going to be a big kind of turn against wind and solar as a result of that. Because, I mean, I can kind of see or understand. I mean, so wind and solar are at times, the sun's not always going to be shining, the wind's not always going to be blowing, right? And so there's going to be needs by which to be able to store all of that energy when you have a surplus. And one of the big problems that they have in Texas is that they can't store it well because we literally don't have batteries big enough, right? Like you don't have enough batteries to be able to store that much energy over long periods of time. I was wondering, and I was thinking about after all that stuff started going down with Texas, and that was a cluster of a wide variety of different things. And all of a sudden, everybody was a genius about the electrical power grids within Texas overnight.
Right.
Everybody on Twitter was like, "I know everything about Texas energy."
Yeah, and of course, I mean, Greg Abbott made that comment about this is what a Green New Deal would look like, when in reality, I think it's something like 15% of Texas's power grid is run off of wind and solar, and the rest is natural gas. And it was actually the natural gas and oil kind of, it was the fossil fuel industry that really kind of broke in this scenario. I mean, everything broke, but
So my understanding,
the failings were not an indictment of wind and solar.
Yeah, my understanding of it, and I could be completely wrong because I'm not going to act like I'm some kind of genius about the Texas power grid. But from a lot of the stuff that I'd read, it was that they, I think, for most of the time, tried to rely on wind and solar as much as possible, but they literally did not have, due to government subsidies, enough basically in place to be able to sustain the base load of energy needed through oil or natural gas. And so once the wind and solar, turbines went kind of bottom up and they froze a little bit, or the wind froze up, they literally couldn't actually back everything up. And then of course, all the natural gas, everything ended up freezing over too, which was, just the mix of the perfect storm. But
yeah, well, and that really, this is the thing. It's like in South Carolina, every time that we have a storm, we have to stay inside because our power lines go down. Well, you go up to the Northeast and they don't have above ground power lines.
Right. They just
Texas is not. Yeah, exactly. Texas is not anticipating an ice storm every winter. And so they're not going to prepare for that sort of thing. I think it was a tragedy. Maybe some of it could have been avoidable, but in general, I think it was just more of a failure of relief efforts than it was a freak thing. It was kind of like Fukushima. That was a freak tsunami to drown the entire island.
Right.
And cause all those failures for admittedly an older power plant that was not very well regulated. But yeah, that's actually an interesting tie-in is the kind of propaganda generated by the right wing regarding that incident, because I think that's probably going to tie into some of the stuff we want to talk about later.
Yeah. I was, yeah, we can definitely get into left versus right, because that's obviously why I have my podcast, right? That's my goal, is to have people on with a lot of different political views, saying and thinking different things. But, I think I can't not talk about the Texas power grid failure and get your take on what Ted Cruz and AOC, if you know about Ted Cruz going to Cancun. That was had to be one of the funniest and most ridiculous political stories that I've heard in a very long time. And that absolutely blew my mind. But AOC gets up, and I don't agree with a lot of AOC's policy, right? I think she's incredibly intelligent. I think she's, one of the smarter congresswomen, or at least if you don't like all her policies, at least a marketer of herself. She's very good at doing what she does. But you have to hand it to her, she got out and she was like, I'm going to raise, she ended up raising almost $10 million, and then going down to Houston, crushed it. I was like, that is exact opposite of what the Republicans needed right now.
Yeah, it is. It was a terrible PR move. Of course, all of this is dumb because it's pointless to just, salivate over Ted Cruz flying down to Cancun and ignore the devastating issues that are going on in our country that need, in many cases, bipartisan support. And I get frustrated by things like the Ted Cruz story. I get frustrated by things like Meghan Markle and the royal family, just because it's such a distraction, and it uses up so much capital, because it just becomes meaningless culture war stuff, right? Instead of meaningful dialogue. So it's cool that AOC pulled this stunt. Now AOC, I think, is a very empathetic person. And I think that she's, a card-carrying member of the Democratic Socialists of America. She's very much, on the side of the people, if that makes sense. So I imagine that was an endeavor undertaken out of the goodness of her heart, but it was also a very good opportunistic PR move for AOC and other Democrats. It was. And I think it's just, I see so much of that kind of tit for tat going on. And in the further partisanship of our politics, meanwhile, 0.01% of the population is accumulating massive hordes of wealth and turning the country into a neoliberal hellscape that will never be able to escape from.
We've got to talk about that then. We've got to talk about the neoliberal hellscape. So you mentioned earlier, and it was, you kind of tied in a little bit with kind of the difficulty that we have in the United States with poverty, and the difficulty that we have with 1 in 5 people going to bed hungry every single night, or children. I think you said children going to bed hungry every night. And then you said two of the reasons why were for healthcare reasons, like not having a proper healthcare system and not having a solid social safety net. like what specific things do you think need to go? Are you in favor of the Medicare for all type thing? Or basically healthcare plan? What type of social safety net do you think would be in place that would actually be able to help a lot of that 1 in 5 children going to bed hungry every night?
Yeah. So I think what you're touching on here is a series of compounding issues. I just read a report yesterday that said that 78% of people who were hospitalized for COVID-19 were obese. And, we know that there's an obesity epidemic in the United States. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that it's a lot easier. I mean, a Big Mac or a Whopper is the same price as a red bell pepper at the grocery store.
Right.
And the way that our incentive structures work and the way that our lack of proper regulation on these massive food producers and agriculture companies results in flooding poor, low income areas with terrible dietary, just terrible food that's making them obese. And we're actually now exporting this obesity epidemic to much of Central America. So that's a compounding issue because that's a public health issue, but it's also an agriculture issue. And then you talk about the fact that those people, once they do get sick, have to choose between, buying a very expensive healthcare plan if they can even afford it, and just going without treatment. And you have a bunch, and this ties back into the minimum wage debate, where you have a lot of people who they don't want to lose their job and they don't want to unionize in order to take on, the interests of these big companies, because if they do lose their job, there's nothing to catch them. They lose their health insurance, they lose their ability to pay rent, and their wages are depressed. But because there's nothing for them to fall back on, or very little for them to fall back on, it's a gamble that they have to take. If we had a functioning public health care system, then I think you would see a lot more people emboldened to stand up for labor rights and that sort of thing. So yeah, all these issues, they're in tandem with each other and they compound each other. As for the specific policy proposals like Medicare for all, I think Elizabeth Warren has presented a plan that's doable. It's going to be very expensive, but I'm also very tired of having conversations with people who are incredibly reticent to do things like set up a social healthcare system, and yet are completely unquestioning of, $1 trillion defense budgets and the kinds of things that we like to prioritize in this economy, which is essentially large corporations buying off politicians and being rewarded by grants, large contracts and policy changes.
Yeah.
And I think that's, a perfect example of this is we just spent $1.7 trillion over the past, I think it's around 10 years, developing the F-35 fighter jet. And the Department of Defense came out last week and was like, yeah, it's basically useless, because between all the leaks that the Chinese and the Russians got from the project and the fact that they couldn't just get some of the technology to work the way it was supposed to, we've now spent $1.7 trillion on a fighter jet project that is useless.
Yeah.
And when you think about the fact that that is the same price tag, nearly the same price tag as the largest, as the COVID-19 relief package, which is the largest, federal stimulus that has occurred in our lifetimes, that's astonishing. And yet, I think a lot of people on the right and the left, and by the left, Republicans and Democrats, actual leftists are very critical of the military-industrial complex and the fact that both parties seem very willing to aid and abet them.
Well, and there's actually a portion of not just the middle ground, but actually some Republicans that are starting to move towards that as well. Starting to not be a huge fan of the military industrial complex. But I guess, hold up, before we get into that, one thing that I was going to say, going back and tying in a little bit to basically the large like defense budgets that we have compared to, we're spending all of our money maybe on defense as opposed to spending it in other places like healthcare. While I do agree with you 100%, our defense budget is absolutely through the roof. If I'm stating my facts correctly, I believe that we are above the next 20 nations below us in terms of the amount of money that we spend on our defense. However, when you look at the percentage of money that is spent on defense within the federal budget as a percentage of the entirety of the United States budget that is spent every single year, it's really only about 13 to 15% every year. Now, in terms of the discretionary money, the defense budget is much larger percentage of the discretionary money that's spent. I think that a lot of the reason why Republicans are very reticent to wanting to include a healthcare package or, a healthcare plan that would be government funded completely is because that would now be non-discretionary money, right? So you already have 66 to 68% of the entirety of the congressional budget that's spent every single year on totally non-discretionary, whether it's Social Security, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, whether it's welfare, which welfare is a very small percentage of that, but you now throw in healthcare as well, and that becomes even larger. And then once you have healthcare out that is not partially funded by employers by any stretch, or not funded by any of the citizens as well, outside of through taxes, the government's on the hook for that, right? Like there's no rolling that back. And so a lot of the I think the Republican reticence to it is not people don't deserve healthcare. I think it's more of, can it be done more efficiently by the free market? And if it can, then why wouldn't we do that as opposed to the government?
I mean, I personally don't think that this is a problem that we should morally put in the realm of the free market to decide. If you truly believe that we have a right to life in this country, then that means that we have a right to health, which means, I'm not really picky, but I think that at least means a robust public option, if not, a full government healthcare system, as it has been implemented in most, modern advanced democratic countries. Right.
Well, we're one of the few developed countries that doesn't have a universal healthcare system of some sort, right?
Right. And because of that, we spend twice as much per capita on healthcare every year. Right. I mean, there's a way that we could do this if done efficiently, that could save us money in the long term, but it's going to hurt a lot in the short term. And again, we never seem to question the priorities of the elite and the corporate class and their needs and the needs of Wall Street. And we seem to be, I think we play a lot more fast and loose with the needs of ordinary working people in this country, because they're a much less powerful and much less influential bloc. And if you need proof of that, just look at where all these politicians go to work after their jobs are done. Well, do they become steel workers? No, do they become farmers? Well, Jimmy Carter maybe, but
right. He's one of the few.
No, they go to Wall Street. They go to large consulting firms. They go to lobbying organizations and then leverage all the relationships that they had while they were in government to get even more tax bonuses and deregulation for their corporate partners. So, yeah.
I think that one of the difficulties that I see right now in terms of our current healthcare system, and I will openly admit that I'm not an expert on the United States healthcare system at this point. Like I try my best to do as much research.
I'm right there with you.
I do my best to try and do as much research as I can around it. But from what I can tell, it looks like and the United States does this better than I feel like anywhere else, but we have the perfect mix of like the worst of both worlds, right? Where we have like a very small portion of like Medicare and Medicaid and government funded for the very like the most impoverished if they, if people have to have it. And then we have an incredibly robust and often subsidized pharmaceutical and healthcare industry that, BioNTech and Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, they're all getting big money from the government in order to be able to produce this COVID-19 vaccine. And they're the ones that are going to get paid out for it, right? Like, it's not going to be the government that gets kickbacks for that vaccine that just came out. Like, it's going to be these companies. And so you're seeing a lot of large corporations that are getting money for their research and development in order to be able to produce and, widely hand out and create products that they'd be able to make a lot of money from. While at the same time, it's the taxpayers in a lot of ways that are kind of footing the bill for that. Because, like you said, there's a bunch of lobbyists right now that are going every single day, marching up to Capitol Hill, that are like, hey, we need kickbacks for X, Y, and Z. And the congressmen are like, okay, that sounds good. You bought me some nice Wagyu steak. I really appreciate that bottle of scotch. Let me see what I can do when I get into, the office today. And I think that like, that's where it's difficult for me. It's like, we can't have this awkward middle ground, right? Like we either need to have a completely free market, right? Where there's going to be widespread competition. It completely deregulated to the point where there's so much competition that competition is going to drive down price completely, which there's an argument, I guess, to be made that there's no way that that could happen. And then, or you need to have a completely government funded option where that is subsidized by the taxpayers and the government is basically regulating the prices completely. But then there's also the argument that that's incredibly inefficient because it's large government. So it's tough because I do feel like we're at this awkward, awful middle ground, where
we're doing the worst of both. I think I really agree with that. I mean, Obamacare was a travesty. It was completely picked apart by the insurance companies to ensure that they got the best things possible. And then delivered a win, quote unquote, for the Democrats. And yes, there are more people insured now because of Obamacare than there were before it. But when I lost my job, I'm grateful to, thanks Obama, because as a 25-year-old, I was able to still stay on my parents' health insurance for an additional year because of Obamacare. So yeah, we're doing it terribly in both ways. And what we need to replace it with is, like you said, either something where the government, there is no such thing as a purely free market solution to this, because markets are created and regulated by government. And to indulge in this Randian fantasy that like, if we just got out of the way, then, companies wouldn't be predatory and emphasize profits over people, then, like I said, that's a Randian fantasy. So yeah. And the thing is, I do not think that I have those solutions. You probably don't have those solutions either.
I don't.
But I think there are movements and conversations that have to be had about our priorities. And I think that's something where I appreciate Bernie Sanders. I appreciate Elizabeth Warren. I appreciate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for moving that conversation. Honestly, I would say to the left, but I mean, even the left in America is so far right that it's really just back towards the center. Ever since Bill Clinton, like the Democratic Party has just lurched so far to the right, and the Republicans have outpaced them by, just going from kind of Reaganism into whatever the Tea Party was, and then just essentially embracing a kind of crypto-fascist death cult mentality.
We're definitely going to have to talk about that. So you're referring to Trump specifically there?
Trump is the symptom of it. He's an important figure in it, but it's bigger than that. But I would say these figures like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, AOC made this point last year. She said, in a European country, Joe Biden and I would not be in the same party.
Right.
AOC, Bernie Sanders,
multiple parties.
Yeah, AOC and Bernie Sanders are like mild social democrats by Latin American standards or European standards. Yeah. The idea that they're seen as too extreme, and we got to trust somebody like Michael Bloomberg or Joe Biden because they're not so radical, when I mean, if you compare AOC and Bernie's policies to anything coming out of the New Deal, it feels so tame. It's really interesting to go back to the New Deal era and listen to speeches given by the Republican and Democratic candidates. And you, like the Republican candidate who was going against Roosevelt, was making promises about the things the government was going to do for people that would have made Bernie Sanders blush.
Right.
And then you think about the fact that this is the guy that got beat by the guy who is even farther left than him. Yeah. And it just shows how much, 70 years of kind of neoliberal policymaking has lurched the center so much farther to the right, to where somebody says, hey, maybe it would be a good idea for, large amounts of our people to not die because they don't have health insurance, is seen as a radical communist idea,
right?
And portrayed so in the media and by the talking heads.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to actually put forth any type of universal healthcare idea as an idea, and he was a staunch progressive Republican.
Right.
So it is interesting how, and I agree with you on a couple things. First is that I think that the far left in the United States is not even close to as far left as the people that are on the left in Europe or Central South American countries, for sure.
Right.
I think that our crazy leftists in the United States, AOC, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, they are very left-leaning, especially by United States standards, but you look into Germany, or if you look in especially in Sweden or Denmark or anywhere in there, and they are a toned down democratic socialist, right? Whereas I also agree with you that, like, especially the Republican Party, especially under Trump, is moving more farther and farther right, but in a weird, like, non-traditional conservative way. It really does seem like a lot of what Trump ushered in was a much more nationalistic, much more patriotic type of republicanism that I really wouldn't even know that I'm not even sure that I would be able to call traditional conservatism within the United States, right? Because to me, traditional conservatism is, fiscal responsibility. It oftentimes is heavily aligned with like Judeo-Christian, like moral framework is what they would tout, right? That's at least what they would say. Whereas I feel like Trump played to that a good bit, but Trump for sure didn't display that, right, in his actions. And Trump, in a lot of ways, pushed policies that was incredibly isolationist. It was not free markets, right? He pushed a lot of things that were very contrary to what the Republican Party normally would have stood for the last 30 years, and yet he was embraced, like, wholeheartedly. The Republican Party sold for Trump completely, right? And it's interesting because it does seem like right now the United States, in a weird way, is kind of splitting and going in opposite directions. Like the left is going farther left, and the Republicans are going farther right, in the sense of like they're going in this weird Trumpian era fashion. Like, where do you see that coming back together? Like you mentioned earlier, like a need for bipartisan like work on a lot of the stuff that we have. How do you get that if you have both parties going in opposite directions?
There is a need for bipartisan work. There is also no negotiating with the Republican Party these days.
I feel like there's a lot of people that would say the same about the Democrats.
There would be, yeah. But I think, even the debates over this COVID bill, I think demonstrate to a lot of people that the Democrats are far less unified than people would like to think.
Oh, for sure.
And there's a lot of internal opposition pulling at the seams. On one end, you have, Ocasio-Cortez and Warren and their cohort, and then you have the kind of Joe Manchin Blue Dog caucus pulling in the other direction. Whereas, with several notable defections, you have a pretty unified kind of Trumpian bloc in the Republican Party, because what started with people being desperately afraid of being primaried and losing support from Trump's voters turned into a kind of Machiavellian realization that if you play into the politics of fascist movements, it can get you very far very quickly.
So when you say,
when people like,
when you say fascist movement, so what specifically are you talking specifically about? Trump? Are you talking about the Republican Party as a whole? Like what do you mean by fascist movements?
Yeah, so this is important. Obviously, this is a very loaded term, right?
Right, and that's why I have to ask.
Right, as my brother reminded me last night, it's about one of the worst things that you can call somebody, at least in common parlance, because people immediately think Nazi, and that's about the worst insult that you can call somebody. But properly understood, fascists don't necessarily have to have anything to do with Nazis.
Right.
Fascism more broadly is, so if we were going to define it, it's a famously very difficult thing to define, because it involves the bringing together of a great many elements that only when they're all assembled do they manifest in a manner that is fascist. And so an important distinction is realizing that fascism is a form of politics. It's not a form of government. So you can have stages of fascist movements. So when Ben Shapiro goes on CNN and someone talks about fascist politics and he rolls his eyes and he says, if Trump was a fascist, do you think you'd be able to call him that on national television? Well, that's a red herring, but that's how a lot of people think, because they when they think about fascism, they immediately think Hugo Boss uniforms, concentration camps, marches, Nuremberg rallies, that sort of stuff. But in reality, those are the final stages. That's the quintessence of what fascist movements become. So if you take a scholar like Robert Paxton in his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, he lists 5 stages of fascism. The first being disillusionment with, the breakdown of liberal governments and political gridlock, manifesting in discussions of lost national vigor and lost national identity. The second stage is rooting, where the fascist movement begins to sort of infiltrate the political discourse coming in from all sides. And I would trace this back to kind of maybe like a Pat Buchanan, or certainly like a Rush Limbaugh type. When you want to talk about 9/11, I think that starts the lurch really towards this kind of Christian nationalist identitarian coalition that ends up manifesting in the Trump movement. So at any stage, these movements can disappear and fall apart. But properly understood, fascism is the cult of a leader. It's a cult obsessed with national rebirth. And the idea is that the leader embodies the nation, and he's the only one who can take on the characteristics of the nation and unify a broad-based popular movement coming from the right against leftist class consciousness and individualistic liberalism, along with things like globalism, individualism, immigration, homosexuality, perceived degeneracy, that sort of thing. And when these things manifest, it is often in the figure of a national chief who's pretty much always male, except in some exceptions. And this figure embodies the group's identity, and embarks on this transformative task. And it's in fascism it's a form of authoritarianism.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. Well, it's ultra nationalism, like authoritarianism. Absolutely.
So as opposed to communist totalitarianism, though, communist totalitarianism is future oriented. It's obsessed with this utopian myth of, if you just give us 3 or 4 more years, we will deliver full communism to you.
Right.
If you just give us some time.
We just haven't gotten the perfect communism down yet, right?
Right, exactly. But, we have no question that in the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism, we will one day accomplish this goal. Whereas fascism is obsessed with the past. It's obsessed with this idea of lost national identity, lost national vigor. And it harkens back to an earlier time where the country, the Volk, the people were more pure, less sullied, less degenerate. And of course, these times are always fictional. If you're a student of history, you know that literally every period of time is shitty.
Right. Because people are sinful people regardless of what era you're in. Just how it's going to be.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's a very compelling form of politics. And another interesting thing about it is Paxton and Umberto Eco and Jason Stanley and some other scholars of fascism always point out that fascisms always take on the national characteristics of whatever country they emerge in. So a German fascism would look very different from an American fascism. An American fascism would look very different from an Italian. Argentinian fascism would look different from both. Each one is going to be pulling on national motifs, traditions, and symbols that are distinct to that particular nation. So where that might emerge in a strong kind of Aryan group identity in Germany, and particularly make its targets the Jews, in Italy, that wasn't necessarily the case. In fact, there were a lot of Jews who supported Mussolini in the early stages and even participated in the March on Rome. And while there was lots of anti-Semitism among the fascists in Italy, it was never so explicitly anti-Semitic as the German movement was. And actually, Hitler ended up kind of exporting that in 1936 to the Italian fascists. In the U.S., with certain exceptions, the American fascists are, I would say, with certain notable exceptions, not going to go down the anti-Semitism route as much. Part of this is because of our strong national association with Israel as a country. But, we have different boogeymen here. And I think whereas the ancient idea of the enemy of the Volk was this kind of subversive Jewish communist who wore different masks and appeared in different ways, I would say it's now kind of your radical street agitator, pro, immigration, illegal immigrant, or Black Lives Matter activists, or Antifa boogeyman type thing. So I don't think there's a specific ethnic identity attached to that. So I feel like I'm all over the map here. Do you have any?
No.
Do you want to dig deeper into that, or?
Yeah, so I'm actually, and I've talked about this actually a little bit on my podcast. I've been, I'm reading right now Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Schreier. When it basically goes through and just details top to bottom, like Hitler's birth all the way through the end of the Third Reich. And fascism is obviously a huge topic that is, the whole book is saturated with basically the details and the inner workings of how Hitler chose and was able to build up this gigantic fascist empire. And much of it was, of course, exported out of Italy because Italy is where fascism really found its birth. And fascism in Italy, Hitler went to Italy and was like, okay, I can see what you guys are doing here, but I'm going to take this back to Germany. I'm going to perfect it. And I think that in a lot of ways, the reason why people, when they think fascist, they think the Nazi flag, is because like Hitler, he perfected not fascism for what it was at the time. And I think that the reason why I think it's really tough for me, I think in some ways, to give a little bit of pushback on I think maybe fascism, which I agree is a right side of the aisle movement, very much in the same way that communism would be from the far left side of the aisle. The difficulty that I have seeing fascism, I think maybe growing in the United States, or Trump in some ways being a fascist type leader, is there isn't a certain level of authoritarianism that I think that you see from the vast majority of Trump supporters, in the same way that you would see the authoritarianism that was present from very, very early on within the movement of Hitler or Benito Mussolini. So when you look through the early 30s, Hitler had the plan written out long before he actually started to garner power within the Nazi Party, as to what he wanted to do in order to be able to accumulate an incredible amount of power. And, the whole reason why he went to jail is because he amassed a mob of supporters with a previous war general with him, and they decided to storm a town square to try and take that place over, right, in Bavaria. So he... I don't see that nearly as much on the right side of the aisle outside of, and I think that you can maybe point to the Capitol riots on January 6th as like, oh, well, maybe this is an example of authoritarianism starting to happen on the right. But to me, that's more of, I think that Trump came in, and I do agree with you, very, very nationalistic, patriotic. He wanted to pull upon the ideas of the past. But I think a lot of it was he there are a lot of people in this country, especially towards middle America, that feel incredibly disenfranchised. And a lot of the disenfranchisement that they feel, they don't feel is being handled and taken care of in Washington in the way that it needs to be. And so the idea of someone coming in and saying, we want to be able to change up and using the exact same democratic process that we've always used, but start to push some of the maybe I don't know the best way to put it is, the best way to push out people that are there that are not there in your best interest. We need to drain the swamp, right? That's very, very enticing to a lot of people, right? And it doesn't seem like Trump is coming at it from an authoritarian perspective of, if these people do not leave, we're going to force them out, right? Like you don't hear Trump saying that everybody grab your guns and we're going to kill all of the congressmen, right? And maybe it's much more subtle than that, right? And it sounds like you're making the argument that these are the first steps towards that, right? But I don't see the all-out, here we're going to be authoritarian and we're going to push in towards that right now, if that makes sense.
So this is an interesting critique, because I find it rare that people do not identify Trump as an authoritarian, because I think a lot of people are in agreement that he is the most authoritarian figure to emerge from the right in recent years. And I suppose that depends on how you define that. Authoritarianism is an aspect of fascism, right, but authoritarianism can also exist without fascism. So, for instance, a lot of scholars say that Franco's Spain or Salazar's Portugal were not necessarily fascists, because they were actually a more traditional alliance of elites and military figures who were just exercising authoritarian rule. There wasn't this kind of Volkish identity and obsession with rebirth, and the formation of this kind of unreal fantasy of what America was and what America could be, that very much goes in tandem with the conspiratorial aspect of the right.
Right.
So I would say I do believe Trump is an authoritarian. I do think authoritarianism manifests differently and fascism manifests differently in the United States than it does in Germany. For instance, the United States has long been an incredibly individualistic nation, and Germany was not. You know, Germany in this kind of Confucian manner emphasized this Volkish identity of the people and their destiny, whereas we idolize John Wayne, you know, and we think of, you know, it's like Nixon said. He said in the 1960s, he said, the choice is clear. This is the party of, do you want the party of John Wayne or the party of Jane Fonda? You know, we obsess with this kind of manifest destiny, rugged individualistic idea, which is actually why I was amazed to see how similar some of the aesthetics of American fascism are to German fascism, because you have kind of the matching hats and the kind of Nuremberg style rallies, and that's actually kind of I wouldn't have expected, and I don't think figures like Paxton or Echo expected that to happen in the United States, to resemble in American a German fascism like that. I think they thought it would manifest in a completely different way.
See, I would say that, and I would say, and I would think that historically Germany has been one of the more starkly individualistic cultures within Europe. And I could be completely wrong about that, but I think that even coming out of like Wilhelm II and, you know, the entirety of the regime that he had coming out of the late 1800s, and then starting in towards, you know, the bit of democracy that they had after World War I think that you saw the large portion of Germany, for the most part, kind of sitting around together and looking at each other and being like, well, I've got to provide for my family because that's all that I can provide for. But with that having been said, I do think that you're right in the sense of like both Germany and the United States, we still have a sense of, well, we got to come into this together a little bit, like if we have to, you know, where, you know, especially in the United States, we're starkly individualistic. Most people don't even know who their neighbors are. And I think that in a lot of ways, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but that is kind of I would think, kind of the opposite of what fascism would really want, right? Like, to me, that would be a huge uphill battle to climb if you wanted to have any sort of gigantic fascist movement within the United States, because fascism in so many ways wants to be able to push this collective underneath this incredibly authoritarian figure. And maybe my interpretation or understanding of how fascism kind of historically has worked is incorrect there, but I would think that in many ways individualism would be a detriment to fascism in its beginnings.
True. Authentic individualism is antithetical to fascism, yes.
Right.
But now you've entered the very important aspect of fascism, which is cognitive dissonance. It's the "don't tread on me" bumper sticker next to the Blue Lives Matter flag. Like, who do you think is going to be?
Right.
Yeah, who do you think is going to be treading on you?
That's one of my favorite things I see.
Yeah, like cognitive dissonance is at the heart of every fascist movement, because you, in one sense, you're claiming to be individualistic and you're the rugged individual, and yet at the same time you are clinging ever more closely to your group identity, which for Trump voters, and I have never said, and I never will say, that every Trump voter is a fascist. I do not believe that.
Right.
But you have the majority of Trump voters are white, conservative, Protestant evangelicals, and increasingly Catholics, circling the wagons around this identity of white Protestant evangelicalism. And the statistics are incredibly stark. When you look at issues of race, policing, immigration, the death penalty, there is something special in all the wrong ways about specifically white evangelical Protestants in the U.S., as opposed to Black evangelical Protestants or Latino Catholic, who are, maybe more culturally conservative, but they don't manifest that conservatism in these weird ways, which in many ways are a callback to a kind of pre-civil rights era of politics. And as the further representation that minority groups have had in government, in business, in media, the harsher this reaction among the specific large group of white evangelical Protestants in America has lurched further and further to the right and further into the arms of fascists and fascist politics, which is why you have, supposedly Christian types falling into the lap of a serial philanderer who's lied, cheated, and stealed his way through his entire career, and who's well documented to be a complete fraud and a grifter. It's because it's about more than a Christian identity. And in many cases, it's about more than a white identity. But the matrix of the two of those creates this strange Christian nationalism, which manifests in things like the Jericho March and the attack on the Capitol, but also more subtly in this idea that the people, the Volk, are besieged by the left and besieged by the forces of individualistic liberalism and degenerate homosexuality and the trans agenda and cultural Marxism, which, by the way, that term was invented by the Nazis. It was original cultural Bolshevism.
Right.
And it was,
that is true.
Essentially a way of saying that, so I'm a liberal. I assume you're kind of a liberal or somewhere in the center. But for a fascist, being a centrist or being a social democrat or being a liberal would be a mask for your true intentions, which are world Marxism or world Jewry or something like that, which is very interesting. The conservative right in this country seems completely unable to distinguish between liberals and leftists, who are oftentimes in fierce disagreement with each other, but it's all the same to them because, that's just a mask. And so they feel besieged by these forces. Their identity is shrinking, and it can be real or imagined. And I think the fantastic nature of right-wing media and its ability to blow up into huge controversies, very minor culture war things, and turn them into huge cultural issues is evidence of this. So yeah, that was kind of a tangent.
Yeah, no. So what I was going to say, I think specifically around the evangelical cultural aspect of this, is I think that there's a very large portion of the right side of the aisle that looks at the United States historically, and they say right now there's more debauchery within the United States than there's ever been. Right. And they say there's a growing movement away from what the principles of the Bible would teach and would preach, and is being promoted, and not just promoted, but in a lot of ways promulgated by the United States government. And that's what I think makes them worried. That's why they're concerned about the idea of their children growing up in a place where debauchery is not just, and when I say debauchery, I mean that in the sense of like, that is an all-encompassing word that I'm using for whatever sexual sin or whatever
decadence,
else.
yeah.
Right. And
degeneracy.
Right. Some type of degeneracy where they are pulling away from, and they're wanting to stop the push towards whatever that may be, right? And I think that you see that actually in a fairly large amount of societies where you have a conservative right side of the aisle, or a conservative movement within every single country that is fiercely opposed by a left side or more progressive side of the aisle that almost always leans in towards some sort of degeneracy. And there needs to be the push and pull of both, right? Because at the vast majority of the end of every single large empire that you've seen throughout world history, it is almost always marked by a very, very large increase in some sort of degeneracy from a wide gambit of especially sexual sin. And I think that when you see the evangelical Christians, especially on the right side of the aisle, when they're looking at and they're seeing, homosexuality or the transgender movement, or even a movement now to normalize pedophilia as well, which is gaining steam within a lot of very far left groups, that terrifies them, right? That terrifies a lot of Christian evangelicals, because they're looking at that and they're saying, well, this isn't the America, right, that I grew up in. This isn't what America should be and what it was at its founding, which we can, I don't know that necessarily America was the moral Judeo-Christian framework that I think that a lot of people like to think it was, but
no, it was a bunch of Enlightenment deists.
Right, which blows my mind.
Set up.
Right.
Yeah, who specifically set up the world's first irreligious state,
right?
Like explicitly.
Right.
I'm curious about this idea. So, I mean, I monitor a lot of far left networks, and I've never seen any sort of movement to normalize pedophilia on the left. Yeah.
So when I say that, by normalize, I don't mean in the sense of everyone should be a pedophile. I mean it in the sense of pedophilia should just be accepted as any other type of sexual kink or sexual, idea that you would want to have. As opposed to some sort of mental disorder, as defined what the DSM would define it as pedophilia as, which I have actually seen, and granted, it's obviously not a very large portion by any stretch of the imagination. I think that you'd be hard pressed to find even many of the most hardened leftists to be like, yeah, pedophilia is a good thing. Let's go ahead and lean into that, right? But I think that is what's oftentimes pushed on right-leaning airwaves, that's becoming normalized.
I believe that, yes, because the right wants to believe that all the leftists are satanic communists who are coming for their young. Right. So I have never seen, I've never seen this on the left in terms of a normalization of pedophilia. Like, I think there's a lot of people who say that, like, pedophilia is something that should be given treatment, like we shouldn't just shoot pedophiles, like, have the people on the right want to do. We should find treatment for them. So if that's a normalization, then I don't know. I think that's just, a decent public health measure. But the right's obsession with pedophilia, I think, is incredibly interesting.
It is,
because you're right. It does come across on the airwaves quite a lot, especially in QAnon. And QAnon is the perfect fascist conspiracy theory, because it involves two particular ideas, two ancient kind of conspiracies. The first is Jewish blood libel, which was the myth in Christian Europe that Jews were abducting Christian children and using them for sacrifices. And the second is the rape of white women in the American South. And this fiction, because it is a fiction, that there was just many instances of African-American men raping white Southern women in the antebellum and in the postbellum era. And we have very few instances, and that being used as a justification for lynching. And we have very few instances of that ever happening, whereas we have multiple records, time and time again, we see the opposite, which is white men taking advantage of their African-American slaves.
Right. Well, I mean, you look at the entirety of the hemmings of Monticello and coming out of Jefferson's lineage. Fantastic example.
And the way that this combines itself in QAnon is you have the idea of sexual exploitation of innocence, and the white woman in the American South was the most innocent of figures. Actually, most white supremacist ideologies everywhere in the world have used the justification of, the immigrants are going to rape our women as a large justification for the things that they do. So you have that. So the sexual exploitation of innocence combined with this conspiracy to take our children, and it manifests in this perfect fusion
of QAnon.
Yeah,
and QAnon
it's so appealing to people.
It is bonkers.
It is bonkers. But if you work a day job and you're a bank teller and you just stay on Facebook all day and your life's not all that interesting, then the idea of joining this crusade to root out the Satanist pedophiles inside the government, and that your dear leader, Donald Trump, is going to bring in the military and lynch them all on Capitol Hill. Like this is where I get confused about this idea of this movement not being authoritarian, because when you have people shouting, "Hang Mike Pence," outside of the U.S. Capitol building, like that to me I think the
totally
Trump movement is incredibly anti-democratic.
Yeah.
It is incredibly authoritarian. And oftentimes the followers want to go even more than the leaders. They want to go even further. Right.
So that was what I was going to say.
So there's this bond between the leader and the people, which is reciprocal. And you saw this with Mussolini, you saw this with Hitler, because it's a shared kind of mental illness that they have, where they live in this fantasy world and they construct this fantasy world around them. Like Adolf Hitler was so convinced, because every time he went to a rally, that, how could the German people fail? We have this Volkish identity. We're on this great crusade.
Right.
And instead of looking at, military plans for the invasion of France, he wanted to look at grand architectural sketches with Albert Speer, about what New Berlin would look like after the war and after the 1,000-year Reich had been established. And in the same way, you have Trump, indulging in this fantasy, along with 70% of Republican voters, that the election was stolen. Because how could it be otherwise? Right. He had told them all along that the only way that he was going to lose is if the election was stolen.
Right. And I agree with you.
You get this construction of an alternate reality there. And I think that lends itself towards this like win at all costs authoritarianism that I think overcomes the instincts of constitutional conservatism, if that was ever really a thing. And I think it is. I know lots of good conservatives. I used to be a good conservative, but the modern conservative movement is anti-democratic.
Yeah. So one thing. So for me, I think that there has to be a bit of a distinction between authoritarianism and populism as a whole, because I do think that there are many facets, I think, to authoritarianism that kind of relies on like a big populist movement, But I would think that there's a lot to be said around the mob mentality of everyone coming together and coming behind something that they all have a shared belief in or a like cause in, right? But one thing that I feel that you don't see, and going back to a little bit of what you talked about, is how sometimes the followers were almost outpacing the leader. Trump never literally said for them to hang Mike Pence, right? So Trump never literally said, I think that you guys should storm the Capitol and try to, absolutely pillage the entire place, right? And that's not something that you necessarily see with Benito Mussolini or an Adolf Hitler, or maybe even down in somewhat. I'm much less versed in like Argentinian type fascism or any other fascism. I think maybe in Central or South America. But I think that Hitler in Mein Kampf outlaid exactly what his plan was, right? Like, he hated Jewish people from the very beginning and wanted to use them as a scapegoat. Benito Mussolini never had that same affinity for wanting to kill Jews, so you see that his people didn't want to kill Jews in nearly the same way that Hitler's followers did. So, like, for me, I think one of the defining characteristics of the establishment of and the pushing towards a fascist movement is the followers almost never outpace the leaders, because the leaders are the ones that are displaying the vision. They are the tip. They're the pinnacle of this hierarchy, and the entirety of the German population wanted to live up to what not only what the vision was, but also what Hitler was. Right, like that. It was appealing to them to be like their leader, and I guess you can make the argument that some of that is present maybe in Trump followers, right? But for the vast majority of the Trump followers that I know, they're able to say, like, listen, he's not the perfect leader that I would want, but he's kind of upholding a lot of the stuff that I think needs to happen, especially from a policy prescription wise within the United States. So I'm going to vote for Trump before I vote for Biden, right?
Yeah, and I think you've touched on something really important here, which is the accommodationism that is at the heart of the success of every fascist movement. Because fascist movements come and go all the time, but they only achieve success when they're able to build a coalition with traditional conservatives, clergy, business elites, and kind of corporate interest in a reaction, large landowners and that sort of thing, against these, what they perceive as leftist class struggle and individualistic liberalism. So even in the case of Mussolini and Hitler, you have lots of people who think that they can control the outcome of this. And they're like, no, we don't really like Hitler. So it's like you have von Papen. He thinks that by giving Hitler the chancellery, that he's going to essentially, we'll put him over to the chancellery. He'll get to do his performative thing. And he's not
He's not going to. He's going to be completely handcuffed. We're going to just leave him over there.
Yeah. And not to play fast and loose with, comparisons and metaphors, but in that story, I think you could say somebody like Mitch McConnell would be the von Papen in that instance, because, he experiences 3 years of, oh my God, we're getting everything that we want because this guy's voters are so energized.
Yeah.
And we have this broad-based popular movement on the right who's supporting us. And then suddenly they completely lost control of it. And the traditional conservatives, the good Republicans, all these types who complain, well, we don't like Trump, but the conservative judges. Well, we don't like Trump, but economic policy. Well, we don't like Trump, but tax breaks, that sort of thing. It's the same logic that happened every time fascist movements gained power. People who did not necessarily agree with the tactics or the rhetoric, but realized the advantages of allying with them, and then suddenly found that they lost control.
Right.
I've experienced this with a lot of my Republican friends who, whenever I would, criticize Trump, they would be like, yeah, man, I agree and everything. And it really, it took the fiction of the stolen election and the assault on the Capitol for them to realize just how far they had compromised authentic conservatism in the service of fascist politics.
Yeah, and I think that you're right 100% when you say there's a lot of Republicans that saw what happened on January 6th and they were like, that's a little bit too far for me. I can get on board with wanting to stick it to China, right? I can get on board with wanting to make sure that we've got conservative justices, and the Supreme Court. But, wait a second. It looks like a lot of these people were very much incited by Donald Trump to go and to riot there that day. And that's not a good look. And I can't get on board with that, right? And so there's this part of me that in a lot of ways thinks that Trump's day in the sun is done, in the sense of, I don't think that Donald Trump is ever going to win another presidency, right? I think that Donald Trump absolutely still has consolidated control of the Republican Party without a shadow of a doubt, right?
100%.
And he's going to work very, very hard to make sure that people like Lisa Murkowski or Mitch McConnell or, you name a Republican that has gone against him, he's going to make sure that they have a hard go of it, right? And a lot of that is just because
the future of the Republican Party will be on his terms.
Right, right. Oh, absolutely. But I also think, though, that Mitch McConnell has the power and has the support within the Republican Party to rebuke a lot of what's happening with Trump right now. And it will be incredibly painful for the Republicans for the next 4 years to 8 years. But I do think that if there is no shedding of this Trump identity from the Republican Party by the time 2024 rolls around, the Republicans are going to be shattered in a way that is going to be incredibly difficult for them to be able to win elections going forward, at least until a new rebirth of a Republican Party happens.
Well, I'd like to agree with you, but they're planning to gerrymander the crap out of every single state that they have legislative power in, and they are introducing massive voting legislation, which is meant to disenfranchise as many Latino and African American voters as possible.
See,
in the coming years.
That's interesting. Yeah. So I'll have to hear, I guess, a little bit more about why you think about that, because in a lot of ways, I haven't seen. I feel like I've read a whole lot of stuff on more left leaning sites that have been like, Republicans are trying to disenfranchise the entirety of the minority vote, right? In Georgia, right? We'll take Georgia for an example or whatever, a lot of other states. I mean, there's something like over 250 different legislative proposals have been either set in motion or passed since the election in the beginning of November, right, to try and change some of the voting laws within the wide gambit of different states, but primarily Republican states. However, in a lot of the research that I've done, I've struggled to find specific instances or policy that Republicans have pushed in order to purposefully disenfranchise voters. So I'm kind of interested to see like kind of what specific things maybe that Republicans are doing, in your opinion, that are like purposefully going after Black and Latino voters.
So that's a really good question. And this goes back to a long-standing tactic ever since the Southern strategy and the shift of the Republican Party to embracing kind of conservative whites in the South. There's an excellent documentary on this on Netflix about voter suppression in Georgia and Stacey Abrams in that story. It was filmed right before John Lewis passed away. And so he actually appears as a contributor in this. So specifically, if you want to get into pieces of legislation that are trying to restrict voter, the ability for people to vote, which are all, of course, couched in, well, we're just trying to make it safe. We're trying to make it more secure. And the reason that's always given is widespread voter fraud, which would be compelling to introduce some of these measures if there was any evidence of widespread voter fraud ever. The Heritage Foundation did a massive study on this with the intention of revealing wide-scale voter fraud on a state and federal level, and they came up with nothing.
We have one of the more secure
86 cases.
Right.
Yeah, I think they found 86 cases of voter fraud, successful voter fraud in the past like 30 years. It was a complete failure from that standpoint, and that's about the most conservative organization that's doing that. Other nonpartisan organizations have found minuscule attempts. So like in the 26 election, there was only 4 people who successfully, or who got, basically successfully did voter fraud. All 4 of them were Republicans.
Right.
And yet voter fraud and massive voter fraud, that's always the reason that's used to introduce these measures. So, well, then why are they doing this? It's because it's a lot harder for low-income African-American and Latino communities to have things like a driver's license or 2 forms of federal or state identification. It is more based on voting patterns. It is more likely that you're going to have white conservative evangelicals showing up on election day. And so you're incentivized to disincentivize mail-in balloting and mail-in voting, because you want to make it as difficult as possible for the people who don't vote the way that your voters do to be able to vote at all. And that's an ongoing, I'm not an expert in voting laws in this country. I'm not an expert in voter suppression. I'm certainly not an expert in voter fraud. I have posted a couple graphics about it, and essentially it's nothing in the United States. So it's not a justification for these laws. But I would say that there is a conversation to be had about the legitimacy of some of these measures. It's just that in every case that they're introduced, in nearly every case that I've seen, it is with the express intention of, we want to make it more difficult for people to vote. The justification being voter fraud.
Yeah, well, so I agree with you wholeheartedly in the fact that the United States has actually probably some of the least voter fraud of any developed nation within the entire world. Our voter fraud is incredibly low, but I think that one of the largest reasons why for that is because we have an incredibly decentralized voting system. And so the vast majority of our voting system is based upon a county to county or a state to state basis, as opposed to it being controlled from the top down, from the federal level down to the county. And that is in a lot of ways a very federalist or a very Republican mantra, right? Where you want things to be controlled at the municipality level as much as possible in order to be able to decentralize the process and make it much more difficult for fraud to happen. And it's unfortunate because I think that you are seeing a lot of Republicans actually moving towards this idea of, and this was all propagated by Trump, but the idea that, like we are, there's a gigantic amount of election fraud, and as a result, we need to make it more difficult for people to vote. Whereas I think that the huge push that's happening right now away from, especially like H.R. 1, which was passed by the House last week, is trying to keep the federal government from stepping into and having their hand more in a lot of what's happening on a state to state or county to county level within the voting systems. And I have to say I disagree that that it is more difficult or that Black or Latino or minority voters can't get an ID. I know if you're saying two forms of ID, there are very, very few places I've found that require two forms of ID in order to be able to vote. But the idea that Black or brown minorities are unable to get voter IDs, I think, or not voter, but federal IDs of any sort, is definitely I don't know that I can totally get on board with that. I think that the vast majority of the Black friends that I have all have IDs.
Well, no, I mean that's fine, but that's anecdotal.
That's fair.
That's an anecdotal example, and that may very much be true in the scenario that you're in. But at a larger scale, it is an issue. That might be something that would be better taken. Maybe after the podcast, we can discuss that in depth and circle back around it. After we've looked at some statistics and stuff.
Yeah, that's
otherwise,
totally
I think
fair.
We might just be talking past each other on the voting thing.
Right. That's totally fair. Because I will say I'm also not extremely well versed in the vast majority of voting laws and stuff as well. It's something that I enjoy to read about, but I'm not an expert on it by any stretch. So,
yeah. I'm not an expert on anything, so I should probably try not to put my foot in my mouth.
I totally hear that. So this is a little bit, I guess, off topic, or honestly, I guess a little bit of something. Well, I guess tangentially related to what we were talking about earlier. But so, what exactly do you do? So I know that you work for FarmLink Project and stuff. What exactly do you do outside of that? Do you have any specific roles with other companies? Do you have a specific, I guess, maybe job title or whatever outside of FarmLink Project, or is that kind of like your sole gig?
So FarmLink is where I'm putting the majority of my energy right now. I've kept up a freelancing, and I started that basically after I lost my last job back in June. And literally the next week I was invited on board, and I've been doing that since, and that's taken up the majority of my time. But I've also had kind of a creative freelancing business on the side for, I guess, 4 or 5 years now. And that's everything from photography, modeling, shoot styling, retail photography, graphic design, text copy.
Gotcha.
It's basically whatever people need. But I'm terrible at advertising it. I never advertise it, and I tend to just do word of mouth.
I was going to say, I didn't even know.
All that.
Yeah,
I'm not great at self-promotion. I'll admit it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I had no idea that you freelance on the side. So that would make sense then. The only reason why I asked that is because I know that you said that you were moving out to California. I didn't know if you were trying to get into I know that you've done some modeling and some stuff in the past, but I didn't know if you were trying to get into acting or any sort, moving out to LA.
No, I mean, I kind of hate Hollywood and never really want to be a part of it.
Oh, gotcha.
and I don't know. I don't think that that's really in my future. I mean, I like, who knows? It might be fun. My roommate is an actor, and I think she really wants me to try out for some stuff. And if I like it, then maybe I'll do it.
Yeah.
I've never considered that to be a particularly meaningful career path for me. Yeah. So
it would be tough too.
I like this place because the weather's nice and it's a new city with a lot of opportunities. So.
Yeah. No, that's totally fair. I've never personally have been to California, but I have heard from so many people that it's absolutely beautiful. I mean, absolutely gorgeous. Yeah. So that is, I think we might go ahead and probably wrap it up there, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, man. This was great.
Yeah, I really appreciate having you on. Honestly, I had a great time. I'm sure that you and I will probably have many more conversations also offline, talking a little bit more too. I really enjoyed a lot of your insight. And honestly, I do have, being based out of South Carolina, I do probably have a bit more of a conservative listenership. And so I think that there's a lot of stuff that I think that a lot of my more conservative listeners I think can maybe glean a lot from and learn a lot from a lot of stuff that you've said. So I really appreciate a lot of your insight here for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, that's one thing that I really try and do a lot of is I was raised a conservative. My family was involved with Republican politics. I was on the Joe Wilson campaign when I was like 10. I was on the Marco Rubio campaign for president, even into my 20s. I think I was like 20 or 21. Of course, this is all kind of pre-Trump, but that was certainly the value set, that we're given, I think, is like people growing up in the American South, the default is sort of conservative evangelical. And yeah, I've had lots of productive and unproductive conversations with conservative friends about these things. And I'm very slow, and I think it's interesting because people are like, well, you're talking about people being fascists and stuff. Isn't that kind of extreme? I really don't think that your average conservative voter is a fascist.
Right.
I think they've made a Faustian.
I would agree with that.
I think they've made unwittingly a Faustian bargain with a fascist movement. But I think that's a different thing from being like they're not true believers, if that makes sense. And a lot of them have good values. And there's certain conservative issues that I'm in support of. Like I am not for unrestricted abortions. I am very pro-gun. I'm very pro-Second Amendment. And that often puts me at odds with liberal friends. But I find if you go far enough left, you find a lot of leftists who are very pro-gun as well.
Right, which is so weird to me. It's so weird.
Well, I mean, here's the way that I see it. You can't both distrust the police and distrust guns. Like, you gotta choose.
Yeah, you gotta pick one or the other.
Yeah. And it's funny because, like, I think the African American community has understood this for a long time. They tend to not be hugely in favor of very restrictive gun control because they don't really trust policing in America. Right. And I think we've seen that demonstrated time and time again. I mean, I'm a registered concealed weapons holder, and when I took my class, it was after the events in June, after the Black Lives Matter movement. Every person in my CWP class was African American and or a liberal. So I think when thinking that Second Amendment activism is a monolith, I think is not the case. I was discouraged to see. I mean, like the bill that passed the House today, I think it's fine. It's just like mandating, more extensive background checks about online sales and gun shows, which is probably warranted. I don't find that super controversial. I don't think it's something that I'll waste my activism on.
Right.
But in general, I would probably depart from a lot of kind of polite liberals on the issue of guns and other issues.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very much the same way. Yeah, that's fair. That is totally fair. So where can my listeners find you?
Oh, Lord. Well, I'm thinking about deleting Twitter, so don't go there. But you can find me on Instagram. It's at Charles McBride, spelled with a Y, not an I. And then you can find me on LinkedIn if you want. And then the organization I work for is at FarmLink Project on Instagram.
Okay, awesome. That works. I appreciate it a ton. Honestly, I enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure we could maybe at some point in the future also have you on again because we really had a bunch of fun talking tonight for sure.
Good deal. Well, next time I roll through South Carolina, we'll have to grab a beer if we can do that in the COVID era.
Well, with all the vaccinations and the quote herd immunity that we're going to be getting here soon, I'm sure we're going to be fine. Everything's open up in South Carolina. You know, we're a bunch of Republicans. We don't believe in COVID.
Yeah, that's true. We never really even shut down, which is why Greenville County keeps getting into the front page of the New York Times.
Right. All right, man. Well, I appreciate it a ton. We will go ahead and knock it off there.
All right. Sounds good, my friend.